after a really mathy and frankly kind of boring module on logic and counterexamples and all that, I like to try to liven things up a little bit by choosing a topic that most people care a lot about and have very strong opinions on. So we're going to talk about the moral permissibility of abortion. Let's get into it. The goal for this module is to understand the philosophical landscape, to sort of be able to see what kinds of views there might be on the permissibility of abortion. We're going to make sure that we don't mix up the legal status of abortion with its moral status, right? Those two things, as we saw with counterexamples, right? Those two things can come apart in both directions. We're going to be looking at some bad arguments on both sides of the debate and talking about like what makes them bad arguments. And then we're going to be looking at two very famous excellent arguments, one from Judith Thomson and one from Don Marquis on each side of this debate. And what's really important here is that you're able to engage and develop a dialectic with a perspective that you might disagree with and maybe even very strongly with. It's important to be able to evaluate arguments that are opposing views, and that helps you be more sure, more confident that, no, you know what, my position is the right one because I've engaged with the arguments on the other side. And to be clear, like this for a lot of people is a genuine kind of dilemma, right? Like what we're going to kind of see is a tension between two values, at least for people who are being like genuine actors within the field. Everybody, I think, on both sides of the debate can agree that bodily autonomy, the right to sort of like do with your body as you kind of please, is an important value. And so is, I think a lot of people on both sides would agree, so is the value of human life. But when it comes to the question of abortion, those two values just come in conflict with one another. And so it's really important that we don't view the other side of the debate, whichever side you're on, as being immoral or irrational or anything like that. One other thing to kind of keep in mind, and I mentioned this before, right, the legal status versus the moral status. It is perfectly consistent, for example, to hold that abortion is immoral and in fact seriously immoral. But to not make the extra step and say that it should therefore be criminalized, right? So there's going to be extra steps that you would need to take in order to have the moral status of something inform its legal status. So we're just going to keep those questions completely separate. And I'll make it really, really clear right now, my job is not to convince you of anything. My job is to simply present the information, help you understand it, answer questions that you have, and let you make up your own mind. Odds are, nothing that I say here is going to change your mind about anything, but what I do hope is that you sort of can appreciate arguments on your side and on the other side of the debate and see that, like, okay, these are genuinely coming from a good place and are philosophically interesting. So, let's kind of explore the philosophical landscape a little bit. Now, these are my terms, and it's this is sort of like kind of watered down. I've sort of got four kind of options here, right? A pro-life and a pro-choice side, and then what we can call like a hardline version of each, and a version with exceptions for each one. So a hardline pro-life advocate would not allow for abortion in virtually any situation. You will get people who sort of will waffle a little bit on whether or not it is permissible in order to save the pregnant person's life. But within like the sort of advocacy group, it's the hardline pro-life view that you're going to come in contact with the most. Most of my students, most of like regular people that I talk to, they tend to be, if they're pro-life, they tend to be in this camp. they're going to allow for exceptions in, say, cases of sexual assault or cases of incest, and especially, threats to the pregnant person's life. Now, for a pro-choice hardline stance, this is going to be a pretty radical view. Radical in the sense of like extreme. That like abortion is just always permissible up until like the moment of birth, and then once birth happens, like it's no longer permissible, it's no longer an abortion anymore. Most people, virtually everybody, right, on the pro-choice side is going to fall into this pro-choice with exceptions. There is going to be some kind of cutoff here. Now, there are other views out there. There's a philosopher named David Benatar. He's what's called an anti-natalist. He thinks that getting pregnant and having kids is actually immoral, and that it's sort of, this is kind of a watered down version of his argument, but it's immoral to like cause someone to exist when there is sort of like guaranteed suffering involved, right? You're putting someone in a position that they're going to suffer, and you're doing so without their consent, which of course, like, how can an unborn person consent? But like, that's kind of his whole point. There are other views out there, but this is going to be sort of our major kind of like broad stroke shotgun kind of focus here. These views here. And to sort of put this in perspective, so again, illegal and immoral are going to come apart. These hardline views are not typically held amongst regular people. I mentioned especially the hardline pro-life view, right? Most of my students, if they're pro-life, they tend to allow for exceptions. When you're talking to somebody who is an advocate, who is like in the public sphere arguing for a pro-life position, the vast majority of the time, at least in my experience, they have been in this camp, in the hardline pro-life camp, and especially when it comes to exceptions in cases of sexual assault. And this is, at the very least, like a more consistent view. Like, why would the circumstances of conception affect the moral status of the fetus? It gets a little bit tricky to sort of explain what's going on in cases of, say, sexual assault that would suddenly make abortion permissible in those kinds of cases. I'm not saying it's like an impossible argument to make or anything like that. It's just, it makes it a little bit trickier. And so that's why you're going to see, honestly, like a lot of advocates, a lot of pro-life advocates just aren't going to allow for those exceptions. The pro-choice side has, a similar issue when it comes to consistency, right? Like, let's say there's like, we're going to cut it off at 180 days or whatever. Like, what's the moral difference between a fetus that's 180 days old and 181 days old, right? There doesn't seem to be like that much of a moral significance. And like, yeah, the cutoff has got to come somewhere. But like, where do we draw that line? And maybe if technology increases, does that change the moral calculation? It gets really tricky. All that being said, nobody's making you have consistent views. It's totally okay if you're like, you know what, I've got exceptions, I don't have to explain myself. Like, okay, that's totally cool. So don't think of this as like me challenging anybody's particular beliefs or anything like that. This is just kind of stuff that maybe just generally kind of be aware of. So this is the philosophical landscape. This is sort of the groundwork. And in the next video, we're going to talk about bad arguments on both sides of the debate. I'll see you then.